In today's video, we're going to be taking a look at evolution for A-level biology. We're first going to look at the theory of evolution, then we're going to look at the DNA sequence data and evolutionary relationships, then we're going to take a look at speciation, so the cause of new species, then we're going to take a look at allopatric and sympatric speciation, and then we're going to finally look at pre-zygotic versus post-zygotic mechanisms. So let's take a look at the main features of the theory of evolution. The first one that we have is that species have evolved over time. Now, between each generation, there are differences to the previous generation. In species that have long generation times, for example, each individual lives maybe 90 years, evolutionary change will be much slower than in organisms, than in species that have a generational time of maybe 10 years. Now, evolutionary change occurs over hundreds or thousands of years. So it happens over a very large time scale. The second point of the theory of evolution is that there is variation within a population. So mutations can occur. There can be genetic variation due to meiosis, as we discussed before. We also have random fertilization of gametes. Okay, so all of these different factors contribute to variation within a population. The third point is that most species they overproduce offspring. Now, the thing with this is that species populations are actually generally maintained at a stable value despite this overproduction. So this means that intraspecific competition is occurring and the best adapted alleles are surviving. Now, the fourth point, so 1, 2, 3, 4, the fourth point of the theory of evolution that we're looking at is that natural selection works as a mechanism of evolution. Okay, so with natural selection, we are able to get evolution. The fifth point is that natural selection acts due to biological variation. So let's actually go ahead and put what we've just talked about and make sense with it. So if we take into consideration, like basically we're talking about what we've talked about in the previous video on selection and variation, but we'll quickly go over it now. So with overproduction of genetically different, genetically unique offspring, we're going to have a variety of different types of individuals within a population. Some individuals will be better adapted than other individuals. So when a selection pressure occurs, what's going to happen is that we are going to have those better adapted individuals surviving against those less favorable alleled individuals, right? So in the struggle for survival, those favorable alleles will win. And then finally, in the theory of evolution, we have one common ancestor, so that we derive from a previous ancestor. And the more closely related we are to another species, the more recent the separation from that common ancestor occurred. So now let's take a look at DNA sequence data. So this is where we take a look at the sequence of DNA nucleotides for a specific gene, or maybe even this entire genome of an organism. Now, mutations, we have three different types. We can either have a deletion, an insertion, or a substitution mutation. Now, mutations can only be passed on if they occur in the sex cells, right, in the gametes of an individual. Now, what happens, so if one organism has, let's say, 10 mutations, and another organism has the same 10 mutations, then they are most likely going to be very closely related. So what we can deduce from this, and from sequencing the DNA sequence of nucleotides of an organism, we can identify how many mutations are in that organism and then compare that with the number of mutations in another organism for a specific gene for specific genes, for example. And based on that, we can deduce how closely related two different organisms are. If they have the similar number of mutations, that means they'll be more closely related than if they were to have very different numbers of mutations. So now let's take a look at speciation. Now, speciation is the evolution of one species from a pre-existing species. And we have two different causes of a new species. The first one is that fertilization between different species could occur. So, for example, in the modern wheat plant that we have, it is thought that an emmer wheat hybridized with a goat grass, okay? And then together, when that hybrid is now wheat, the wheat that we know today. The second method of speciation is reproductive isolation and genetic change. And then that will form demes. Now, the two types of this type of speciation is allopatric and sympatric. Now let's take a look at allopatric speciation. So before we go ahead, it's important to understand what is a deme. So in every population of every species, there will be groups of individuals that interbreed with one another. And these subpopulations that are created are called demes. So in allopatric speciation, what we have is we have two different subpopulations, two different demes that are geographically isolated, okay? They have a barrier like an ocean, like a huge mountain range, for example. Maybe for a snail, it could be a small stream, okay? So it's important to understand that for different species, there are different barriers that cause allopatric speciation. Now, how speciation actually occurs due to this geographical isolation is because, for example, in environment A, there may be different environmental conditions, different climate, different food source, etc., compared to environment B. So in environment A, natural selection will occur in favor of some specific alleles. In environment B, natural selection will occur again for some specific alleles that are different from those in environment A. And over evolutionary time, over many, many generations, what we will end up seeing is we will see two different species being created that are reproductively isolated from one another. Now let's take a look at sympatric isolation. So sympatric isolation is the reproductive isolation that occurs despite the individuals living in the same area. There are two types. There's ecological and behavioral isolation. So ecological isolation is when individuals living in the same area will occupy a unique microhabitat, which will have its own specific climate, maybe a little bit of a different food source than the other individuals. And these individuals will interbreed with one another, and these individuals will interbreed with one another. And over time, what's going to happen is that the demes, right, because now we will have demes, will create new species themselves. In behavioral isolation, what happens is that due to differences in courtship behavior, or maybe some different individuals are attracted to a different phenotype, what's going to happen is slowly and steadily, some individuals will interbreed with one another, and different individuals will interbreed with one another. And again, we will have speciation occur, right? These individuals might have some form of mutation or something that occurs, making them a new species, and these individuals as well, in different mutation that makes them a new species, okay? And that are then reproductively isolated. So that's very important, is that reproductive isolation is speciation. So now we've taken a look at three different types of pre-zygotic isolation, right? So we've taken a look at geographic isolation and allopatric speciation, and then we've taken a look at ecological and behavioral isolation, right? So these are all happening before the zygote can even form, right? Before the sperm fertilizes the egg. But some post-zygotic mechanisms for speciation could occur to prevent a normal zygote, so what would normally be a fully viable offspring, to not be viable anymore. Okay, so some mutations could occur, and this will prevent two different groups from being able to mate with one another, which will then mean speciation will occur. They'll be reproductively isolated.